This series of lessons should provide an introduction to the fundamentals of the C# programming language and programming in general. Now, if you're already an experienced software developer coming from another platform or another programming language, then frankly, these might move a little bit slow in some parts. You might be better served to find another resource to use as a starting point. But if you're completely new to programming and you're new to the C# programming language, then this is a great place to start. We're going to walk through every action and we're going to talk about every single line of code that we'll write together. And I'm going to try to anticipate the problems that you might experience while typing in your first lines of code as you're working through these exercises. Based on my interaction with absolute beginners over the past 12 years of helping people just like you learn C# and .NET through videos just like these. Okay? These videos were recorded using Visual Studio 2013 Express for Windows Desktop, which is a free edition of Visual Studio available for download from Microsoft.com/express. And this is also important. Since we're merely covering the basics of the C# programming language, the things that I'm going to cover in this series of videos will apply to all versions and all editions of Visual Studio. So this includes Visual Studio 2008, 2010, 2012, 2013, and whatever comes next. It also means that you can use the Express editions or any commercial versions that you might have access to of Visual Studio. So in other words, and I can't more emphatically state this, as long as there's a C# to learn, these videos will still be valid. When new versions of Visual Studio do become available, the features that are added rarely affect the features that are relevant to the absolute basics and the fundamentals of C# in particular. So you can watch these and follow these videos 10 years from now, and they should still be valid. In the very next lesson, we're going to walk through the installation steps of Visual Studio 2013 Express for Windows Desktop. Now, feel free to skip that lesson if you already have Visual Studio 2013 Express for Windows Desktop installed, or if you have any later version of Visual Studio installed. To get the most out of this series, you should be an active learner, meaning that you should attempt to follow along. I call this getting your hands dirty in the code. There's no better way to learn than following along and writing the code yourself. Pause the video, rewind the video. While I do make the code that I wrote available for download, and you're welcome to reference it if you like, you should really be typing this in yourself into your own copy of Visual Studio. Furthermore, I would encourage you to not be in a rush to complete this course. If something doesn't make sense, again, pause the video, rewind it, watch it again, or find other articles or the resources on MSDN or Microsoft.com or Channel 9 or Microsoft Virtual Academy or my own website, again, www.learnvisualstudio.net, that could help make that concept clearer. Like I said earlier, if you're new to programming, I'm excited for you. You're embarking on an exciting journey that's immersive and is rewarding. And you can do this. If you've ever gotten stuck in the past trying to learn to program, I promise you that if you put in the time and you work with me, that working together we're going to build a knowledge of C# and you'll be well equipped to move on to more advanced tutorials where you can learn how to build your own web, Windows, and phone applications. And if you ever have any questions about this series or if I can help you in any way, please feel free to write me personally at bob@learnvisualstudio.net, or you can contact me on Twitter at @BobTaber. So after installing Visual Studio 2013 Express for Windows Desktop in the very next lesson, we're going to create our first program in lesson number 3. It's a simple program that we're going to build on until we get the fundamentals under our belts. So I hope you're excited because I am. So let's go ahead and get started. See you in the next lesson. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with www.learnvisualstudio.net, where I teach beginners the skills that they need in order to get their first software development job building Windows and web apps at the world's best companies as quickly as possible. In this lesson, I'm going to install the free edition of Visual Studio named Visual Studio Express that you can use to follow along with the rest of this course. If you already have some edition of Visual Studio 2013 or greater installed, such as Express or Professional, Premium, or Ultimate, then you can skip this lesson and continue on to the next one where we build our first app. Also, if you're adept at installing your own software, then I'm willing to bet that you'll probably figure this out on your own. Okay. Like I said, the free edition Visual Studio Express can always be downloaded from Microsoft.com/express, and it will forward you to the right page. It happens to look like this now, but they change it up occasionally, so don't be jarred if it looks a little bit different. And on this page, you're going to quickly come to realize that there's not just one free Express edition, but there's several. And you're going to choose the one that you need based on the platform, or rather, depending on the type of application that you want to build. So, for example, if you scroll down on this page, there's Express 2013 for web, Express 2013 for Windows, Express 2013 for Windows Desktop, and Express 2013 for, where are you? There you are, Windows Phone. And so this is vitally important. You need Express 2013 for Windows Desktop. If you do not have this free edition of Visual Studio installed, then you won't be able to follow along with me as we work through the exercises in this series. Now, if you already have Professional, Premium, or Ultimate, all those editions have all application types available from your single Visual Studio installation. But that's not the case with the free edition Visual Studio Express. There are other differences as well, but generally you're only going to need the Professional Edition or greater once you learn C# and .NET and you need some advanced features, or whenever you're working with a team of developers. So a common mistake that new developers make whenever they're attempting to follow along in the series is that they mistakenly download Express 2013 for Windows instead of for Windows Desktop. So you would use the Windows edition for building store apps, you know, like the Windows Store. And we have a whole series about that on Channel 9 and then also on Microsoft Virtual Academy if you're interested in that. But we're going to use, let's get back to the desktop, we're going to use, where are you? There you are, Express 2013 for Windows Desktop to create simple console window applications in this course. So locate the Express 2013 for Windows Desktop edition, and then you'll click the download link. And you'll see a panel reveal that describes more about Visual Studio Express 2013 for Windows Desktop. In this panel, you'll also have several options, whether your download languages prefer to be English or something else, whether you want to would want to install the DVD or just the little installer. So in ISO, this DVD5 ISO image, it's basically just a DVD image that includes all the features, even those that you may not need, and therefore it might take a little bit longer to download. So honestly, I recommend that you choose that first option by selecting the Install Now link. All right, that'll take you to another page that would ask you to potentially log in. As you can see, I'm already logged in, but if I wasn't, I would see a page that looks like this, asking me to log in. So I'm going to go ahead, log in, and then I'll have the option to either download the Express 2013 for Windows Desktop or Ultimate. And I wouldn't recommend this one yet because it's a time trial. So let's just go ahead and choose Express 2013 for Windows Desktop. If you're using Windows Explorer, you're going to be asked whether you want to save the installer or run it. Typically, I just click the Run button, but you might choose to click Save if you think you'll need to install it again in the future. So when the installer begins, you're going to have the option of installing onto a different folder or drive. I generally leave the default locations alone. However, you might want to change this if you're running out of room on your primary hard drive. You're also going to be asked to read and agree to the license terms and the privacy policy by clicking the checkbox. And once you've agreed to the terms, then you want to click the big install button at the very bottom of the dialog. Because Visual Studio will need to modify some of the settings of your operating system and your file system, then you're going to be presented with a UAC, User Account Control dialog, asking for permission. So we want to click the Yes button. And so next, the setup application will begin to create a system restore point, which is a standard installation procedure to allow you to get back to your computer settings prior to the installation if something goes wrong. And then it'll start to download the relevant components of Visual Studio onto your computer. So I have a pretty fast internet connection, and still this takes about 10 minutes to go through. So you might want to take a quick break while you're waiting for this and come back in a few minutes. Okay, so once everything's been set up successfully, then you're going to see the successful setup message in the setup application, and we will want to click that launch button here at the bottom of the window to start Visual Studio. And here again, we're going to ask to sign into Visual Studio. This time it explains that you're going to gain some benefits from signing in. However, you can skip this step if you want to with that little link below the sign in button. I'm a conformist, so I will click the sign in button. I will put in my account, and as you can see, Visual Studio will search online and set up this copy of Visual Studio according to my previous preferences. And after a moment or so, I see the Start Page tab loaded in the main area of Visual Studio, indicating that I'm ready to get started. So now we are ready to write our first lines of code in C#. In the very next lesson, we'll see you there. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with www.learnvisualstudio.net, where I teach beginners the skills that they need to get their first software development job building Windows and web apps at the world's best companies as quickly as possible. So in this lesson, I want to show you how to build the most simple C# application, a Hello World application. It'll simply display the message Hello World in a Windows console window. Now, I'm not going to attempt to explain much in this lesson. You're going to get a feel for the workflow. In other words, how to create a new project, where to type the code, how to test your application and see it working, and so on. So for now, just try to follow along and don't worry if something doesn't make sense immediately. Over the course of the next lessons, we're going to dissect this tiny little example, and we're going to explain every line of code that we write and why we did it. So I'm going to assume that you already installed the most recent version of Visual Studio Express Edition or one of the greater editions, and you're asking yourself the question, what do I do now? Okay, so first what I want to do is close down. If you're following along from the previous lesson, we left it in this state. I'm going to go ahead and close this and show you how to get back to Visual Studio. So what I want to do in Windows 8.1 is go to see all my apps by name, and I'm going to find Visual Studio Express 2013 for desktop in the list of apps. I'm going to right click it, and that'll bring up the little taskbar, and I'm going to select Pin to Taskbar. And so now whenever I return to the desktop, I can see that Visual Studio icon is in the taskbar for our convenience. And so if you want to, you can remove this after the course, but it's just a nice quick convenient way to get back to it. All right, so let's go ahead and click the Visual Studio icon, and we'll launch Visual Studio. And so in Visual Studio's File menu, I'm going to select New Project. And in the New Project dialog, I want to choose a project template to start with. So first of all, you want to make sure that you're working with the Visual C# templates, okay? I can't tell you how many times I've selected Visual Basic and I didn't mean to. And then we want to choose the console application in that center pane. And then I'm going to type the word, I'm going to remove the name that was there by default, and I'm going to type in hello, capital W in world, no spaces, capital H hello, capital W world, and then I'm going to click the OK button in the lower right hand corner. And then after a moment or so, you'll see that Visual Studio will create a new project based on the project template that you selected, the Windows Console application. Okay, so you're going to come to understand what a project template is and what it provides for you throughout the remainder of this course. For now, let's just keep moving forward, okay? So the dialog disappeared, and we're loaded into the main pane of the IDE, the Integrated Development Environment. So I want to find this opening and closing set of curly braces underneath the word static void main, all right? And I want to type in the following code. And so I positioned my mouse cursor, as you saw, kind of somewhere in between, and then hit the enter key on my keyboard. I can do it a couple times just to make some space for myself where I'm going to begin to type. And then I'm going to begin typing the word console. All right, and notice when I do that, I get this little pop-up menu that pops up under where you're typing. So don't let that distract you for now. Later, this is going to become your best friend. But for now, just ignore it and continue focus on typing the following code between those two curly braces. So console.WriteLine, and then I'm going to use double quotes, 2 double quotes, and type in the word hello space world between those 2 double quotes. And then I'm going to put a semicolon at the very end of the line. So console, capital C in console, dot, write line, capital W, capital L, write line, no spaces between those 2 words. An opening parenthesis, a double quote, the word hello world with a space in between, then another double quote, a closing parenthesis, and then a semicolon at the end, okay? And so now let's do the same here with read line. All right, so again, capital C in console, period, read line, capital R, capital L, opening parenthesis, closing parenthesis, nothing in between, and then a semicolon at the end. Okay, so I want you to inspect the code to make sure it looks just like what you see here on my screen. Again, capitalization is important, as is the spaces or lack of spaces, the use of special characters like double quotes, parentheses, whether opening or closing parentheses, semicolons, and so forth. It has to be identical, okay? And so if you see any red squiggly lines underneath something that you typed, that is your cue that Visual Studio is giving you that you didn't type something correctly. So take a moment to carefully inspect your work before going forward. All right, so what we're going to do is click this little Save All button in the toolbar here at the top. And then I want to run the application. So I'm going to click this little Start button in the toolbar. It's next to that little green triangle button. All right, and so if you did everything correctly, you should see a Windows command or console window open up with the message, Hello World. All right, awesome. So let's go ahead and click the red X in the upper right-hand corner, and you can see that Visual Studio returns to its state. There might be some other windows open. You can just close those for now, all right? So if you see a message that there were build errors, then it's probably because you typed something incorrectly. So let's go through a few scenarios, some common problems that people have when they first start writing software. Okay, so when you see this dialog, there were build errors. Would you like to continue and run the last successful build? Choose the No button, all right? And when you do, you're going to see an error list that will appear docked by default at the bottom of the IDE, at the bottom of Visual Studio. And it'll give you clues as to what went wrong. The quickest remedy is to take a close look at what you typed in and see how your code deviates from the code that I wrote. And so here are some possible error messages and their remedies. So first of all, you can see that I have this invalid token, the parenthesis in class struct or interface member declaration, right? And as you'll learn, the curly braces define a block of code or a code block. Different commands belong in different types of code blocks, and we're going to discuss those in an upcoming lesson. But for now, if you see that message, it's probably because you didn't put the code in the right place. Make sure that you're putting it in between this opening and closing curly brace underneath the word static void main. So I'm going to just use my mouse cursor, highlight both those lines of code, hit Control X on my keyboard, move my mouse cursor inside, and hit Control V on my keyboard to paste it inside, and that should get me back into a working state. All right? All right, so if you see the build errors dialog and the message is that there is a semicolon expected in lines 13 and 14, and so to fix this, all you need to do is just add a semicolon to the 2 lines of code that you wrote, like so. Just like a properly formed English sentence must finish with punctuation, C# code also has to conclude with a semicolon. You are missing that in 1 or 2 lines of code, and so by adding it back in, your application should run. Great. If you see the build errors dialog and you get the message that there was a parenthesis expected, invalid expression term, parenthesis, and then a semicolon expected, or something along those lines. Well, this is a little bit trickier to interpret from the error messages, admittedly. The words hello world must be surrounded in double quotation marks. Make sure that yours has double quotation marks around the two words hello and world, like you see here on my screen. The reason is because we want those two words to literally be written to the screen, and so we use the double quotation marks to denote that those words represent a string literal. We'll talk about strings and string literals later in these lessons. For now, just apply those double quotes around hello world and you should be good to go again. Great. If you see the build errors dialog, and you get the errors that say the name console does not exist in the current context. There's a good reason, because it's not lowercase c in console, or maybe you misspelled the word, but I suspect, as many beginners do, they don't realize that C# is case sensitive, so it's not lowercase c in console. You see the little blue squiggly line kind of giving you a hint. It's capital C in the word console. So as I said a few times, C# is picky about capitalization, so make sure you type exactly what I typed from now throughout the end of this series of lessons. Console with the lowercase c and console with a capital C are two different things as far as C# is concerned. So just capitalize the code, or capitalize the C in console, and you should be good to go again. Great. Similarly, if you get the build errors dialog and you see system console does not contain a definition for write line or read line, it's similar. It's because the W in write line must be capitalized and the L in line must be capitalized. The R in read line and the L in read line have to be capitalized as well. All right, so again, precision is important with C#, and there are some shortcuts that'll help you improve the speed and the accuracy of typing when you're in the Visual Studio Text Editor, and I'll talk about those a little bit later, and they are a godsend, and they will help you never to get it wrong. But if you see something that says that you know console should have a definition for write line, I mean, I wrote it, it's spelled correctly, make sure that the capitalization is also correct, all right? So if you find some errors or issues whenever you're typing in the code, try to pay attention to the error list like we have up to this point and let it guide you to help remedy the situation. Honestly, it's usually something pretty small. Once you learn more about the C# syntax, these issues will occur less and less often, or at least you'll be able to spot them or identify them quickly using the little blue and red squiggly lines that appear under your code. We'll talk about what those mean in an upcoming lesson. Okay, so assuming you got this to work, you're well on your way to building applications. As you undoubtedly learned in this lesson, writing C# code is an exercise in preciseness. Fortunately, the IDE will help you write code correctly, or at the very least, it's going to show you where you went wrong. So in the next lesson, we're going to focus on the syntax of the C# code that we wrote. If preciseness is required, then you're going to need to have some explanation as to what all these little words and these symbols mean that we've been typing in. It's really easy once you get a few basics under your belt. So we'll see you in the next lesson. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with www.learnvisualstudio.net, where I teach beginners the skills that they need to get their first software development job building Windows and web apps for the world's best companies as quickly as possible. So in this lesson, we want to start with the process of dissecting this first tiny little application that we created. I want to spend a few moments to look at every line of code in this file, this program.cs file that you see here in the tab name, as a basis for future exploration in C#. So first of all, let's take a quick review of what we did in the previous lesson. First of all, we used the Visual Studio IDE to create a new Hello World project. And then we wrote code in the area that was defined by those two curly braces. We made some space for ourselves and typed in 2 lines of code. And then we ran the application by clicking on this little start button here up in the toolbar. And this opened up a Windows command line window, the console window. Our application appeared. It was simple. It was just the words Hello World displayed in that window. And I didn't point this out, but you can use the Enter key on your keyboard to actually move past that that pause in the application and let the application continue on and exit out, all right? And at which point that Windows command line window just disappears. So I hope you can see how your actions when writing and building the application are manifested whenever you ran the application and interacted with it. But what I really want to do is cement these ideas in your mind because they really provide the basis, the foundation for everything that comes next. So let's start from the inside, the code that we actually wrote, and work our way outside. And so we used a programming language called C#. There are many programming languages in the world, but at this moment, C# is one of two popular programming languages used to create .NET applications. C# is one of the main programming languages that Microsoft supports in Visual Studio. And so I'd highly recommend that you learn as much about C# as you can over the coming days and weeks. It's probably your best choice as you're getting started. Now, most developers aspire to master one programming language when they're first starting out. But once you master a single programming language, learning a second and a third language will be easier because many of the concepts will transfer over, even if the syntax is just a little bit different. As someone who has been writing applications for over 20 years, I can assure you that C# is a great programming language to start with. So when you learn how to write applications with C#, learning the syntax of C#, or in other words, the nouns and the verbs and the punctuation of the programming language, is just half of the battle. The other half of the battle is learning about related pre-built functionality available to the programming language. In our case, Microsoft has created something called the Dotnet framework. And while that sounds mysterious, it's actually not that bad. For now, there are just two parts of the .NET framework that really concern us. First, there's a class library, which is simply a library of code that Microsoft wrote to take care of difficult tasks so that we, as developers, don't have to worry about them. So there's library code to help with math operations, or working with text, or displaying things to the computer screen, or transmitting information over the internet, and a bunch of other stuff. Okay? So that's the first part, the class library. The second part of the .NET framework is called the runtime. It's also known as the Common Language Runtime, or the CLR. And it's just a protective bubble that your application lives inside of. And I use the phrase a protective bubble because the CLR, the runtime, takes care of low-level details so that you, the developer, can focus on what the application does and less about how to interact with the computer's operating system, its memory, its hardware, and so on. Furthermore, the CLR provides a layer of protection for the end user so that you, the malicious, evil software developer, you can't do much harm to the user's computer, at least not without their approval or their knowledge. All right. So for right now, it's the .NET Framework class library that I want to focus on. So when we typed in the phrase console.writeLine, we were using some code in that class library that knows how to display text in a Windows command line window. And all we have to do is tell it what we want to display, or rather, we just have to tell it the important part, okay? We don't care how it writes the text, we just care that the text gets displayed to the screen. And that's what we did here in the first line. Okay, so let's focus back on this code. When I wrote this code, I made sure to emphasize that you must write the code in the correct place between the opening and closing curly braces, otherwise the application will encounter an error whenever you try to run it. We talked about that at length. The correct place was between that opening and closing curly braces, as you see on the screen. The curly braces define a code block, a block of code. So as you can see, there are several sets of curly braces. And you can think of this as a series of containers. I'm going to oversimplify for just a moment, and we're going to build on this definition later, but this innermost code block that's defined by these curly braces, they have a name. And the name of that block of code is main. That's the name of this code. And this code just so happens to be executed first when the application comes to life, when the application is executed. So let's not worry about those other words there like static and void and string and args. We'll get to all that a little bit later on. But this entire code block here, it defines something called a method. And a method is simply a block of code that has a name. Later on, you're going to come to realize that a method is much more than that, but let's just use that as a working definition for the next couple of lessons. The method has a name, So when you have a name, you can call that name and you can execute that block of code associated with that name. Again, more about methods a little bit later. All right, so the main method lives within another set of curly braces like you see here. It's a class named program. Think of a class as simply an organizational tool, a way to keep all of your methods organized. You put all of the methods that are somehow related together in a single class. Now, what do I mean by related? Well, that's up for you to decide. And as you get deeper into programming, you're going to come to understand the philosophies of writing code that will dictate where the code should reside. In fact, a class is so much more than just an organization tool. I really oversimplified it. But just like I said about methods, let's just keep it really simple for now. Let's just use that as a working definition for a couple of lessons until we get a chance to talk about creating your own classes a little bit later in this series of lessons.